This week, Emmet is joined by Dr. Matt Finch to dig deep on Al Ewing and Joe Bennett's The Immortal Hulk. It's the parts of the story that don't work that make it interesting. Or do they work? How does Ewing's Hulk compare with Greg Pak's Hulk? And much more. First, if you appreciate the work we do on deconstructing comics and our other podcasts, we'd love it if you'd support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. Check out our goals and rewards and pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics.
Hello, this is Emmet for Deconstructing Comics. Now, today we're going to be talking about The Immortal Hulk, a very successful, critically acclaimed Marvel comic written by Al Ewing, majority of the art done by Joe Bennett, covers by Alex Ross, and Paul Muntz on colors. I'm joined for this episode by Dr. Matt Finch. Dr. Matt previously was on Deconstructing Comics to talk to me about Iron Man. It was a very involved conversation. The Immortal Hulk itself is a very involved text, so we've got a couple of roads to go down here.
Emmet, it's good to be with you. I don't think we'll have any problem at all. What a fascinating, rich comic, loads of stuff to get your teeth into. Elements that are maybe you can question and quibble with, but precisely in the imperfections of this 50-issue run, there's loads and loads to be said. I think where we'd initially thought about starting was just to try and even get your head around 50 issues worth of comic and all the little bits that spun off from it. Was to give people a sense of this comic, sort of its take on the Hulk, the idea that the Hulk is a monster that comes out at night, that Bruce Banner, the scientist who turns into the Hulk, he dies quite often at the start of this comic, and the Hulk emerges as a kind of resurrection, and it's very much a horror comic at the outset, and then it goes to some quite cosmic places by the end of the journey.
Yeah, we go from horror to social commentary, to all-out mysticism, and everywhere in between. It's a very involved, as I said, very involved text. And yeah, I think, as I said to you before, I was seeing so many critical raves about this book. And then you were one of the few lone voices of dissent that I saw. So that's why I was interested to talk to you about this.
Yeah, I think for me, this is a comic I subscribe to, the rare mainstream comic that I subscribe to. I read it cover to cover. I really enjoyed it. And it was precisely in the sense of sometimes feeling this need to question it and pick at corners of it and see what was really going on there, that I felt something more than just a kind of uncritical love. And I think one of the things we get to do in this conversation is deconstructing comics is all about the craft of comics and how are these things put together and what do they mean and what does it mean for us to talk about them. So I think there's actually a sort of hearty meal to be had here.
Yeah, and criticism also can come from a place of love, and certainly the degree of effort being expended by this run is notable, and its ambition is also notable, so that's why it's worthy of speaking of. Maybe as a point of departure, I'll read you a segment of a review from the Comics Journal, and it is titled Gebi de Genskin, and this is why I wanted to read this out, just the way he opens here. Somehow, Ewing and Bennett are being paid well enough to actually focus on making a comic, something most other creative teams are not granted. And if they're not being paid well, this comic shows some truly admirable month-to-month discipline. The most unique part of this book, when contrasted with how most contemporary comics seem required to behave themselves, is the color. So often with corporate comics, I'll treat a mediocre drawing as on par with Rembrandt, because if anything decent is still visible once a swath of arbitrary neon hues are dumped over the lines, what was there at the start must have been terrific. The rotating group of colorists who work in this series, Paul Muntz seems to get the most assignments, eschew such excuses. Their color amplifies the deeply creepy vibe at play here, painting layers of toxic, fleshy, modern, roided out texture onto Bennett's pencils. These colors reek of detergent, mixed urine in an uncomfortable modern restaurant bathroom, which fits the medical grease feeling that Immortal Hulk gets at every issue. The implications of amping up your brawn so much that you actually open up a doorway to hell. He gets a bit Joycean at one point there.
It's lurid,
Yes.
but that's the thing, isn't it? It's these rich colors. It's absolutely right, I think, to say that this is a very sort of fleshy comic that glorifies in that notion of the sort of mutability of the body, that wants things to be lurid, and is, I don't know, now in hindsight, it calms down. I think the first half of this run goes to a place where you think, okay, this is really doubling down on the absolute original promise of this character as a kind of horror comic, as a deeply ambivalent creation. And then at some point, the momentum shifts, and there's just a couple of wobbles, which are interesting wobbles, but I feel like it doesn't quite come to this promise of that original teaser poster, where, you know, it has this line of you'd never notice this man. He doesn't like to be noticed. He never complains. Well, you could walk up and shoot him in the head, and all he'll do is die until night falls and someone else gets up again. And it begins as a horror comic, but then it actually quite softens, I think, by the second half of the run. I don't know if that's your perspective.
I mean, I think the pun you could make is, you know, this shouldn't be called the Immortal Hulk, it should be called the Interminable Hulk, because there's this continuing and next and next and next, and as revelation after revelation, you know, unfolds, you have this sense of, well, where is this going? And I certainly think your description of it being soft is interesting. I think it falling into a sort of rhythm is definitely a point. And also there's a sense of, is this going to run out of track before the end? And the solution that Ewing's script comes up with, and sort of Joe Fixit, the grey Hulk persona that Peter David, I believe it was Peter David created Joe Fixit, the sort of Las Vegas casino bouncer personality with the Hulk. He's a wise guy. He sort of sees the way things are going. And when he encounters the one below all, and the whole, you know, motivating force of Hulk and all the other gamma irradiated people that we meet over the course of this series, and apparently there's been centuries of this as well. This is not a story that started with Hulk. It preceded him within his own family line and within human history. Joe Fixit makes some comment to the effect of, well, this is just a part of the narrative. This is just a part of this story. This is not, we're just here for this bit of it. Which almost feels like a get out of jail clause for, okay, we don't need to actually resolve this story. This story is an aspect of a much larger story, which is going to keep going. And Hulk walks away, in effect, from this story, from the Immortal Hulk, from Al Ewing's run, going, well, that happened. Like, I feel like that's almost the way it lands. And that's where you have that disappointment, because it's like, you expect with all of this build-up that it's going to lead to something. And what it leads to is this essential question, what is the Hulk? And it's a questioning ending. It's not a answer. And it's funny that I should be the one saying this, because I tend to like this kind of material generally, something that leaves me with some feeling of ambiguity, but I generally had a sense of, at the end, well, why did you take us on this journey if you weren't going to actually address, you know, in a sort of, let's call it climactic way? But how did you feel about the ending, having finished the whole thing?
Well, yeah, I think there's something to what you say of, I mean, the overall arc of the beginning and end place is, you know, the Hulk comes to see that he's kind of one of God's creatures, so to speak, but that he's almost like a cross between Job and an avenging angel, that the world needs for there to be this merciful force of destruction. And that's why we need a Hulk that can go around and smash. But along the way, there's just something happens with the architecture of the overall series at quite high level, where you go through a series that's a bit repetitive, where you're like, oh, which gamma affected character are we going to meet this month? But then there's some little turning point that doesn't quite hold, where there's a particular moment where Gamma Flight, who are pursuing Hulk, and they're the people from the old Canadian superhero team Alpha Flight. They fully turn and become his allies, and the base that was the base of his pursuers becomes the base of his backup team. And there's something where it just feels like a rotation instead of a progression. But I also wonder if it's partly a problem with the antagonists, that the baddies in this are very mustache twiddly, like Dario Agger, the head of Roxxon, like an evil corporation, Samuel Stearns as the leader. They are very mwahaha villains. And I wonder if that's part of it as well.
Yeah, it's funny because there was a point where I had forgotten the leader had gotten involved, Stearns. And I guess there is one major revelation at the final issue of the comic as far as the shared family history of Stearns and Banner. Like, that's it. We can get back to that. I think that's an interesting conversation. But there was a point where I was thinking to myself, wait, which evil mustachioed guy is the antagonist now? Because you also have Brian Banner. Brian is Bruce's father, who's an abusive, violent man, and he sort of emerges as this clip-off or a shell of the One Below All, this sort of representation of violence. And, you know, Bruce is still frightened of his father. There is still the sense of Bruce being both the abuser and the victim himself. And there seems to be, even in this notion of the one above all, the one below all, there seems to be this notion of, we start with the violence between father and his son and that cycle of abuse. And then we keep moving out and out and out and out and out until we get to God and creation and the antagonist to God or the anti-God and destruction. And that's Ewing's attempt at a sort of grand overarching schema, if you like. And in doing so, the Hulk is at the heart of it. So any antagonist you introduce is a footnote, despite the leader more or less being genre savvy enough to skip to the end, see what's happening, and go, all right, I'm going to try and get in there. I'm going to try and be that antagonist. I'm going to try and be that true antagonist that this series needs. And we're told how dangerous he is. And it was a certain point where we actually see the leader in the below place. And I was like, oh, is that who that is? I literally had this moment of, oh, that's the guy now. Oh, okay. I think that's where I felt something similar to what you were describing before, that sense of losing track of where we were.
Yeah.
You know, but I appreciated the grandeur of the idea. I remember at a certain point going, did someone in editorial not understand and have him dumb it down a bit or something? Because I feel like there was a line that maybe we needed just to give it some clarity.
I think one of the really interesting things about this whole run and about Al Ewing's tendency to try and do cosmic stuff is this kind of, one of the things I wrote down like 4 questions at the end of it all was, you know, what comes after science? Like, so often comics offer these mythologies, these things to play with. Very explicitly, they say, you know, the gamma radiation that turns people into things like the Hulk, it's both a scientific phenomenon, but it's also this magic thing that creates metaphorical figures. And in Defenders, which is kind of a spin-off from this as well, our heroes venture into the universes which precede ours. One of them is entirely scientific. The next one is entirely magical. And it becomes heady. But I think it misses the thing that's so great about this run is when Al Ewing nails the relationships between Banner and his ex-wife, and dealing with parents, even with friends, even with the colleagues in Gamma Flight who are chasing him. The relationships are astonishingly rich and satisfying and complex. The cosmic stuff, I mean, you can risk sort of disappearing up your own green door in a way.
Nicely done, yeah. I didn't like the sort of glimpse of an evil future where the Hulk becomes the destroyer of worlds Or in the choice as is framed in the last issues, he chooses between Golochub and Gavora. So that's Cliffoth versus Sephiroth. So there is that's that Kabbalistic aspect to this run. Characters just drop that into conversation. Look, we don't need to do a whole discussion of the Kabbalah, but it's definitely a sort of thematic run through of this series. And from, I think, back to issue 12, issue 11, issue 12, it's there. The geek in me still did enjoy seeing Mr. Immortal survive till the very end of existence. Mr. Immortal was still there. I was like, yeah, Kabbalah's all good, but there's Mr. Immortal there.
I mean, I think this is one of the great joys of comics, is because they're quite economical and efficient as a form, you can pull together so many different references, and they can be visual, they can be verbal. And I think it's a real strength that you can kind of cherry pick bits of Kabbalah. You have, 50 plus years of continuity, and you can stir them into the story. I think it's really interesting to talk about as well the extent to which Al Ewing's vision in this is sort of nourished by the work of Elizabeth Sandifer, the critic who wrote a massive guide to to every single episode of Doctor Who, which drew really heavily on a Kabbalistic interpretation, and particularly this notion of the Klipoth, this the hollow shell, which is in some way evil. And I think there's a richness there, but it really interests me of what are we trying to do when we mix magic and science in these stories? What kind of framework are we trying to build for ourselves, and why?
It's a full split. I've never really understood it, because the natural philosopher would be part scientist, part mystic almost. You're inquiring mind. It's like holding up a Western, holding up a detective novel and going, well, clearly these are two at odds philosophies of life. No, they're two different genres of thought, that's all. Or storytelling versus genres of thought, if you like. It's interesting, as I said before, we learned that Banner and the leader, they share a heritage. And these two figures are a holy man. I believe he's a reverend. I don't think he's a priest. I think he's a Protestant holy man. And a natural philosopher / early scientist. Gamma has just been discovered. The actual form of radiation has just been discovered. I think he mentions Röntgen rays at one point, or there's an allusion to Röntgen. And then they have this very Cain and Abel fight. And one thing I wanted to ask you, and I think we can loop back to Elizabeth Sandifer because of the vertigo of it all, and the Al Ewing is the inheritor of the house that Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman and all those folks built. Sandifer's written a lot about these people. Did you think that the two brothers, the Cain and Abel types, actually resembled Cain and Abel from Sandman? Because I thought that was a visual nod.
Now you say that, surely. But to me, that was almost the least interesting thing.
I didn't quite understand why it was there. Yeah.
It was up there with Secret History of Tony Stark, when they started playing with his parentage. I think that was in Kieran Gillen's run. But where the good meat was for me was the sort of emotionally sort of turned up to 11 vibe of things of early in the run. It's when Banner's like, there's this irrational thing inside of me, and it's smarter than I am. It can't reason like I can, but there's a line very early on where he says the Hulk's cleverer than I am. It just doesn't think like a person. And the sort of really torrid relationship with the ex-wife, Betty, who becomes the harpy, and she sort of refuses to take her human form around Bruce. And then they end up sort of getting back together and consummating in monstrous form. In this bit, it's absolutely, you're like, yeah, that's what I'm here for. Like, if we're going to have comics with sort of big, lurid, monstrous figures, it should be because they sort of embody some truth about us that we can't see when we're in our own skins. So the idea of these two coming together with this fraught history, with this woman who's had everything horrendous that you can do to a woman in comics has probably happened to Betty Ross Banner at this point. And so she has this really, she doesn't want to be the sidekick to his story. She's very much the hero of her own story. And then you have this moment where in their monstrous forms, they come back together. And to me, almost that was the closure of the series. It happens like 2 or 3 episodes before the end.
Yeah.
I was super uninterested in Lineage. but really excited on what's going on within and between these characters in the here and now.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned this all because we sort of touched on this in our correspondence before this recording, but I see Ewing in his Loki Age of Asgard book, in his Guardians of the Galaxy book, Defenders, I haven't read all the way through, but I'm impressed with what I have read of it, but also his Mighty Avengers series as well. Anything he's done for Marvel that I've read, I've seen somebody trying to make logical sense of everything that's gone before. The Grant Morrison Batman ethos, where it's like everything happened. Doesn't matter if it contradicts everything else, that it all happened. And one of the ways this series calls attention to that is there's a couple of times where they signify how ridiculous or extreme events have occurred in the life of Hulk and his assorted cast, including Betty, through a shifting art style. So in issue 3, we are introduced to Peter David character of Hotshot, another Gamma person. But every time these characters around Hotshot talk about Hotshot, the art style shifts. So we go from a sort of Archie type art at one point to a very 90s grim, gritty art. And it keeps shifting and shifting, shifting. And the other time that I can remember it happening is also when Betty Ross's relationship with Bruce was being framed in this period detail that's related to the 1950s, 1960s, which is very much the early Jack Kirby art, and then cutting with present day.
She's dressed like Jackie Kennedy at one point. Really nicely done.
Again, the incongruity of it, like, well, how long a time are we talking here? But like, that's the point. It's drawing attention to the fact that their life together was ridiculous. It was so. Her dad was trying to kill her boyfriend, which are their relationship.
And I think this is the thing I like. So when this comic tries to be clever, I'm not so excited. But when it really twists on the emotional stuff, the relationships, like when having that weight of history and turmoil increases the intensity of those relationships. Like, we have loved one another. We have been wed. We have been like in a position of hatred and betrayal. I've died for you. You've died and not told me and come back. My father is chased. Those kind of things I love. I was there for that. Al Ewing does an absolutely brilliant thing with Doc Samson, who is sometimes the Hulk psychiatrist, and with Walt Langowski, who's Sasquatch, who was a Canadian attempt to make a Hulk rival. Yeah, he says these guys are kind of interchangeably the kind of beta male to the Hulk. They're always trying to catch up to him, and they never do. So they end up like he kills off one, and then, he kills off one and then the other when he doesn't need them. And by the end, he puts them in each other's bodies, as if to say, the point of this guy is to be the number 2 guy. I love that.
Yeah, and Walter at least is aware of that. In fact, he resents it. Whereas Samson is self-aware, but I think he still feels he's fulfilling a role. Like, he genuinely wants to help people. Like, that's what his focus is. His focus isn't being a superhero. I think Walter always wanted to be a superhero. He's the jock made good who decided to, become a Hulk for the glory of Canada. But yeah, you're absolutely. I hadn't thought of that, but calling attention to how interchangeable they are is interesting. And in the vertigo of it all, as I said before, one of the aspects of Vertigo comics and comics that ape that approach to making comics is to attempt some sort of literary quality. And I think this goes to your point about trying to be smart versus being smart. And I was trying to work out if there was some sort of system behind the literary quotes that opened each issue, right? So you had like the likes of Victor Hugo, you had George Eliot at one point. The first issue opens with a Carl Jung quote, and it's as a personal rule of mine. I on the face immediately hate anything that quotes Carl Jung. Going, oh, you're trying to be smart. You're trying to say something. If you're using a Carl Jung aphorism, I'm already giving you side eye. Was there some sort of attempt here in quoting these Victorian novels, these Gothic novels, these sort of grand novels, if you like? Was there a sort of calling like this statement of intent in terms of this is going to be a novelistic comic book run, or what do you think meaning of that was?
Yeah, I think it sends a signal to the reader about ambition and expectation. And I think grandeur is a good word for that. I think it's super hard to get away from Jung with the Hulk because of this notion of the archetype,
the shadow,
right?
Yeah.
And it's almost like when gamma radiation shines on you, your archetype will come out. And actually, I wanted to pick on that bit because I think when you have these conversations, it's so easy to get caught up in technicalities of what happened in issue 32, or how does Zobulon's powers work, or whatever the thing is. But I was thinking about what would happen if you were exposed to gamma radiation. And like the journalist in Immortal Hulk, she develops this kind of all-seeing vision. She becomes like a Tillinghast resonator from H.P. Lovecraft. She can see
it's
all the
Lovecraftian. Yeah.
But with you, I was thinking, because it's so difficult to do yourself, because you've often come back to this Momus, this god who is like the god of criticism and the god who calls people out on Mount Olympus and calls the truth. Like, would you become some kind of gamma critic? What would you become?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. Momus, I don't think I actually relate to Momus that much, because I feel Momus was a critic who made a note of everyone's failings, and that's why he was very good at describing things, because he saw everything that was wrong. Whereas I'm the opposite. I think I always try to look for the strengths in things, and when I call attention to something that is a critical failing, it's always out of disappointment, because I was rooting for you. I genuinely wanted you to be good. So I'm not sure. I think I would be an overly empathetic Hulk. I would feel too much for everything. I would be the weeping gorilla from Promethea. I reckon that's what it would be. I would just be sitting and crying because I could feel everything all at once, and I would be overstimulated, and I'd just be crying, and that would probably be me. It's not a very heroic aspect.
Having just, I know you rescued a puppy today in the pub in beautiful sort of autumnal Melbourne. I can see this as a heroic aspect to yourself.
I don't know. I think it was very much me picking up this dog and walking into a bar and going, "Does anyone know who owns this dog?" And everybody else had to do the thing to get the people to come. I just was calling attention to the fact that this dog was lonely and almost got run over by a car.
But so you see, there was jeopardy. You were the one who took the action of the protagonist. You don't have to solve the problem. You just have to instigate the solution. I think you already, the empathetic Hulk is already here. Just if you had the gamma radiation, you'd get the powers to go with it. But there is a serious point behind this as well. And one of the things I think the point of the 50 issue run is to say is kind of, why are we here? Why does there have to be a Hulk? And that even applies to what we're doing now. It's nice to have people listen. It's nice to share your opinions. We're here because we're friends as well. But what is it about this process of unpacking something and exploring it that gives you something, or that sort of manifests something that matters within you?
Well, I think, for one, is what you were getting at before when you talked about the things that worked because they were smart in a very direct way through using the medium of comics. And I guess I'll come back to what I was saying myself before about why I value something as a critic, is because I want to see the good in it. I feel a run like this that manages to impress so many diverse people for so many different reasons raises the bar for comics generally. And I have a feeling of love for that, and I'm protective of that, because I want people to appreciate just the capacity of comic books to do this, to have ambition, to actually get an emotional response to the relationships of these characters, the use of art, the use of color, Joe Bennett's ability to depict utter horror in this series, and Ewing's like wit with a line. Like, you just turn your emotion with a single line. All of these things in concert, just, I think, are a great example of why comics can achieve so much as a medium, and that excites me. And that's why I want to talk to someone like yourself about it as well, because I want to draw that out. What frustrates me is where you have a work like this and it's seen as it's well written, it's good, it's smart, it's it's critically acclaimed. And then maybe it just sits in a box. Tick, excellent run by Al Ewing and Joe Bennett and everyone else involved. Like, okay, that's good. Move on to the next thing, which is kind of what's happened. The series has ended. We're now moving into another Hulk, and he's back to his smashy ways, because the wheel keeps turning and just keeps pumping out pap. Whereas whenever you have something that has a sense of itself, a sense of thematic richness, I'm not saying that needs to keep going perpetually, but I would like it to be called attention to, and I go, okay, that was good. Now do something else like that. Now do the next one.
That makes total sense. There's this lovely line, of all things, it's about the films of Ozu from someone called Pedro Costa, who said the primary function of cinema is to make us feel that something isn't right. And I can't imagine anything less like an Ozu movie than Immortal Hulk. But I think there's a sense in which there's disquieting stuff which gets embraced, and also that there's a kind of putting right. I think it's insufficient and inadequate, but maybe it's the best you can do within a corporate comic today. But a real emphasis to question, who gets to be angry. There's a very specific bit where it's called out of course, Banner, he can be as angry as he wants to be because he's basically a smart white guy. And then it digs into questions of sexuality and has some trans representation in there, which again, in the context of, I was really curious. I was like, who's written the Hulk? What kind of storylines has it been possible to tell with this character in the past? And what kind of creators have been able to use Hulk as a vehicle? And I hadn't realized, but there's this horrendous sort of gay panic storyline.
I was just going to bring that up. Yeah, Hulk had, I think, a couple of gay panic issues. The one I'm thinking of was the one where he's almost raped in the YMCA, which I believe is what you're referring to as well. And I was thinking about this as well. It's interesting that the Hulk did have an AIDS storyline in the 80s, and thankfully it wasn't the character who contracts AIDS was not a homosexual person. It was a heterosexual person, which I think for the Incredible Hulk to actually have this storyline and raise awareness of this is not like what do they call it? They call it gay cancer. There was some horrible coverage of AIDS in the early 80s, and the complete dismissiveness towards it as an actual public health concern. And for the Hulk to be part of the counter narrative of no, this actually affects so many people. The Hulk being a discussion of sexuality is actually a consistent element of the run. And as you say, Ewing introducing these themes, it's part of his role. He is a person who consolidates what's come before him. He tries to create this through line. But yes, he recently wrote a piece on Medium. I think I commented on it, in fact, where he was saying, well, I've realized this about myself. And he had this awakening about his own sexuality. And I feel like he used the comic at times to address that or raise that. I think he also did it in Guardians of the Galaxy. Star-Lord has a similar awakening, and I thought it was quite beautiful that he was able to address that in this work. It's not just about speaker's corner or creating this sort of staging ground for social commentary. It's also the personal investment of the creator. Well, here's how I feel, and here's what I want to address in this work.
Well said. And I should say, Jim Shooter wrote this astonishing...
That doesn't surprise me whatsoever.
It's just me not being sufficiently au fait with all the names of the writers and editors of the past. But I think Al Ewing coming out as bi genuinely gives a different context, even to some of the bits where this comic I would have previously said, reading it, you haven't quite hit the mark there, or you're reaching for something you didn't get. When you see this as being also a chance for people to reflect on literally feeling comfortable in your own skin in the context of the Hulk and the mutability of bodies, and this being this sort of meditation on identity, I think, again, it's precisely what you perceived in me as being a kind of critical thing or not an unquestioning cheering of the comic. It was precisely the ways, it's a bit like Shakespeare's problem plays. It's precisely the bits that don't quite hang together which make this such an interesting and worthy comic to talk about.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly why I approached you as well, because it was like, well, then let's get into it. Let's actually see why this doesn't hang together. If it is that it doesn't hang together, or if it's that maybe we are reading it in a way where we're not giving it a due opportunity. Yeah, no, I have to say I'm impressed with his ambition. A cloud hangs over the series now because of the artist Joe Bennett. He was found to have produced anti-Semitic art, all bound up with politics in Brazil. Like, it's a whole other conversation we don't really need to get into. But it actually had made its way into the comic as well. He'd introduced a panel of art, if you like, involves the Joe Fixit character visiting a jeweler. And it was framed within a sort of anti-Semitic context again. And the version I read, that art's no longer there. Like, it's been erased from the run. You can't get it anymore. But it's also created this sense of profound disappointment that one of the collaborators, who is so talented as an artist, would then lend their talent to hate speech, in fact, and racial unrest. And I guess that again speaks to Hulk as a work. You know, there's so much in it that is ambitious and excellent, and pushes the boundaries of what a corporate comic today is capable of. Not that it ever wasn't before, just right now it's quite a narrow focus. But also problematic and disturbing, and invites discussion around, well, what are you trying to say here? What's this? What kind of depiction of the Hulk are we? What's meant to be bringing us in mind of? And it gets a bit. Once you learn more about Bennett, you start to reinvestigate the series, and you start going, what's going on here?
Yeah, I think it's part of why this run comes to be interesting is the challenge of this kind of reprehensible element that comes in. There's so much of the world as it was just a couple of years back in this comic that it is sullied by it. There are elements that make this comic also glorious. Like we've just talked about the journey from the shooter version of Hulk to a version where there's a really nice sort of trans narrative in it. And it captures the extent to which this story was sort of open to being messed up by the world. Like, really, all of 2018 and 2019 is pretty much in here. All of the pre-pandemic world is thrown in here, and some of that is unfortunate and has rightly sort of been expunged as far as that's possible. But it also speaks to why this thing is interesting, because it's like a sort of dirty mirror on the 20 teens, I think.
Yeah, I was hesitant to introduce that metaphor, if you like, but that's how I feel about it. That's, I don't want to be pat about this. I don't want to sort of, oh, well, there you go, it's a depiction of our times. I mean, there's a direct responsibility on the part of the publisher and the part of the collaborators involved. But I think that's what it is. It's shining a light on just how fucked up we are. And Jackie McGee, the journalist who, as you say, eventually develops this ability to see more than she possibly should be able to see. Like, she sees so much. Her identity as a Black woman is front and center for her whole character arc, and the fact that she sees more than anyone else can see seems to speak to, well, she as a Black person sees more than America allows itself to see. And the myth of America and the myth of American identity and American history and American culture, she just cuts right through it every time. And it was frustrating again for me to see some discussions about that speech that she gives, and the discussion between her and Hulk about, well, who gets to be angry? Well, you're a white man, everyone's bending over backwards to try and facilitate your anger. I can't be angry. I always have to be above it all. I made the mistake of going online to see some discussions of how that went. And it's like, oh, what about all those times when Hulk really suffered and she's not even giving him a chance to explain it? I was like, okay, it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor. The discussion relates to a thematic concern of the book. It's Like, we don't need to cite chapter and verse of all the different Hulk books going back to the 1960s and Steve and Jack and like unpacking, oh, well, he suffered all these times. That's not what that scene's doing. It's meant to make you to reflect on what's happening right now. And hence the discussion of racial inequality, BLM, all that stuff is cited here.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And I think the notion of it being a mirror, a mirror can't reflect the past. It can only reflect the present. I think that's really key. I mean, even as we're speaking now, not that long after the 2022 Oscars, where there's been a huge opportunity for society to discuss who gets to be angry, what kinds of violence are condoned, what kinds of violence are condemned, both on the individual and the systemic level, like without presuming to pitch in and adjudicate at all. It's been really clear that, having Roxane Gay in the New York Times writing response to that, that whole incident has really created an opportunity for people to discuss and debate what kinds of violence matter, who gets to be angry and for what reasons, and how can they express that. And in a tiny way, it's very, very mild in this Hulk comic, they just acknowledge, yeah, the angry white guy turns into the green guy and he kind of gets a free pass.
Yeah, there's some line as well. Let's see if I've got it here. In the world of the superheroes, when something smashes your home to rubble, they just build it back again better than you. Which again speaks to the fact that superhuman violence in this series is juxtaposed with the level of destruction that unfolds. Like, I loved that you had was it Wine Bar? So Len Wein. So it's clearly a nod to Len Wein. Hulk goes to Wine Bar, WEIN for those listening, to have a drink, and the owner's like, please don't do anything. And he's like, no, I'm just here to have a drink. And everyone else leaves, and he's like, no, I'm just here. I'm not going to touch your bar. I'm just here. Get me some of that fancy whiskey. Let's go, And then Thor just rocks up and trashes the joint because the Avengers are there to put Hulk down. But they trash the bar. There's no, let's go out in the street or let's go to a remote location. It's like, no, let's just plow in here. And there's some line again where Ewing there's an allusion to the fact that Thor is not acting the way Thor should. There's some influence here. It's one below all. There's something happening. But there's also the sense of the Avengers can trash a city, but they're heroes. The Hulk will always, he'd always be a monster. And at least he acknowledges it. And he sort of enjoys, I think towards the end of this run, he's sort of getting the joke about that. He understands that you need to hate me to justify the fact that you're as bad as me. We're on a parallel, but you get to be heroes. I'm the monster. There is something again there about violence as abuse and violence as action, to just, justified action. And the Hulk gets to do both. And he's offered a choice and he chooses one at the end, but it could have been the other. And he at least is honest to the fact that he's made that choice, whereas everybody else insists, no, I'm a hero. I do this. I do justified action. That's what I do. I think that's interesting. I think it got to a point where I felt, yeah, I get it, man. I get it. Hey, thank you. All right, we're back to the Avengers again. You're talking about the stink of 2017, 2018. I feel the stink of Jason Aaron's Avengers is over this book as well. There's just so much nonsense going on in that book. And it sort of infects this because it has to, because they've got a Hulk on their team. So we have to get them involved too.
Keep seeing them back, yeah. And that talk of teams means we'll probably have to talk about Alpha Flight and the Canadians turned spacefarers in a moment. But the other thing that occurred to me was thinking about this when I was thinking about that discussion about who gets to be angry and Banner as this kind of privileged white guy was I was thinking about heroes like Spider-Man, where because it could be anyone under the mask, like you can find black fans of Spider-Man who've talked about, well, actually there was an opportunity to identify in a very lily white sort of pantheon of heroes, precisely because actually you don't see him under the mask, or the way that Walter Mosley uses the Thing in his comic, and someone says, what's your ethnicity, and he goes, well, it sure ain't white, because he's this big orange rock guy.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about when Greg Pak wrote the Hulk. And you have a Hulk who is, subject to extraordinary rendition. You see a Hulk without Banner as this green gladiator off-world. And the Hulk ends up in Amadeus Cho's body. So you take the stereotype of the whiz kid, the calculator, the Asian boy genius, and you turn him into a Hulk. To me, that was almost much more interesting than people give credit for. And the interesting thing is, even though that has been hugely influential in the movies, influential in other media, it's not perceived in the same novelistic, grandiose way as this run. And yet, actually, I think there is shed loads to be said about Greg Pak's run on Hulk, which is just as profound and just as significant in the context of early 21st century talk about heroism and race and who gets to be angry. It's all there already in Pak's Hulk.
I think the distinction is that Pak was a fan favorite writer, and Planet Hulk and World War Hulk and all those things were like month to month best-selling works, and there's a lot of online chatter about them and everyone loved them. Whereas the Immortal Hulk, I think a lot of fans liked the Immortal Hulk too, but it was very much a critically acclaimed run. I'm not saying that critics didn't love Pak's run, but I do feel they really went to bat for Ewing and Bennett's run. And the Alex Ross covers give it a sense of prestige as well. There's this sense of it being, this is it, this is the statement, the Immortal Hulk. Let's get into some Kabbalah stuff here. Like, it's very much higher level attempt.
But then that becomes the interesting question then of whose run gets prestige. Because really, I went back to the Amadeus Cho Hulk, Totally Awesome Hulk, just to sort of look around before we were talking about this one. And I was like, this is what the Hulk kind of gets removed from Banner and put into this other guy's body who has a totally different attitude, a much healthier mentality, and who thinks he can handle it, but kind of can't. And when Cho comes into this run, he says to Banner, whose plan is to kind of bring down the status quo, he says, yeah, you're an angry middle-class white guy talking about revolution. That stuff doesn't always work out so well. I'll be watching you. Amadeus Cho is my Hulk. Like, he's the one I want to see front and center every single month. And I think that actually just having the journalist acknowledge Banner's it's like almost the minimal post Black Lives Matter approach to what the Hulk could and should be, maybe. And
yet somehow still manages to be passed off as a radical moment. That's the upsetting bit. Like, as you say, it's the minimum, but like it still stands out for being a comment. The fact that there is a comment at all is radical. Is, oh my God, I can't believe they went there. Which is frustrating for me.
Coming up, was Hulk created to be a sympathetic monster? The comebacks of Absorbing Man, Puck, and others. What keeps us interested in superhero comics? And more. But first, a reminder to join us for trivia quizzes, reviews of The Amazing Spider-Man by Lee and Ditko, and more. Check out our goals and rewards at patreon.com/deconcomics. If you'd rather give a one-time donation, you can do so via PayPal by sending it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
Are you Batman? Oh, you must be, because that's Robin. Hi, Robin.
Yes, Batman and Robin are here, and Tim and Paul are also here to evaluate the Batman TV show that took the nation by storm in 1966.
How in the name of purple wombats did they manage that?
To the Bat Polls podcast looks at the writing, the music, the guest stars, how the show fit into its times, and much more. Look for it wherever you get podcasts or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com. Why, listening to the Bat Polls even makes Season 3 enjoyable.
Gosh, yes, Batman. When you put it that way.
Yeah, and it comes back to what's the limit of what this kind of comic can do, and why are we reading it and not another one? And there's something there about these toys, these figures that we almost play with, like the action figures of our youth, of our childhood, that actually is great to have a nice familiar archetype like the Hulk that you can move around and have it do things in stories. I think that's why this run intrigues me rather than I just kind of celebrate it in an uncomplicated way, because you can feel it's constantly straining at the limits both of what's possible and even of fulfilling its own ambition. And yeah, I just find that absolutely intriguing. There's a kind of yearning. There's something there that yearns to be fulfilled, but can't quite be fulfilled in this run, I think.
Yeah, and there's a sort of capitalist logic to it as well, in that, this is a run. It will end. There will be another team on it because it's a piece of corporate IP. The characters in the movies, we need to keep this train moving. We need to keep going. So there will be another Hulk with a completely different setup and completely different, but somehow it'll have to make sense. So who cares if it makes sense or not? It's going to keep rolling and rolling and rolling. So there can't be a grand conclusion to it. Sorry.
No. Just to come in on what you're saying, I think that issue of corporate IP is really interesting because in the sort of middle part of this run, Hulk devotes himself to fighting Roxxon, the evil oil corporation, who's now more like a sort of blend of the worst aspects of Fox News and Facebook, and which is brainwashing America. But what amused me was, of course, Hulk has to fight them in this comic, because by the end of the comic, Hulk is this force of creative destruction. But of course, that's also one of the motivating aspects of capitalism. And so they need to give him someone to smash that shows, I'm not that kind of creative destruction. Right. And you end up with this very thin critique of the media of like, well, if only we could get rid of the evil Minotaur who's making everyone consume fake news, the world would be okay.
Yeah, and which comes from Jason Aaron as well, because I think that was a major aspect of his Thor run too, which is another one that I think was critically acclaimed, and I kind of bounced off it, particularly with the Roxxon stuff, because I was going, okay, but what are you trying to say? You're trying to say it's one bad apple? Like, is that what you're trying to say? Like, which is nonsense. But yeah, the evil corporation run by Minotaur, amazing piece of critique.
It runs up against the limits of what these stories can do. I actually think, and it's like thinking about the Amadeus Cho Hulk. It's like thinking about when Jane Foster was Thor. I wish we had just moved on. Yes. And I think one of the great things about there being Marvel movies now is the fact that actors age and get replaced. And there's an extent to which you'll be forced to have generations and consequences and successors, at least until you reboot, if you choose to do so, in a way that comics never do. The elastic never quite snaps. It always has to go back to the same people. And part of me just wants to see the elastic snap. And I think maybe in comics, the elastic is just too tough, at least in big two comics.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly, when you talk about IP, you talk about something which the value of it is in some way associated with the length of time which it's existed. Like that counts towards its value. On some spreadsheet somewhere, the fact that this was a work created in the 1960s matters to the dollar value of it, and matters to why they keep publishing the thing. And I'm very happy that things like Miss Marvel and Squirrel Girl, well, Squirrel Girl technically isn't a new creation, but it certainly has been reinvented, have thrived, given that sort of spreadsheet logic, because they found a market, they found an angle, and they worked it, and they're out there, and they're doing great, and they're going to be in movies now as well. But it always comes back to the valuation of the property. You can't just have an Amadeus Cho book because Bruce Banner is the one everyone remembers. Bruce Banner is the one who has an age range of potential fans. Amadeus Cho is still a relatively obscure creation, even though his story is so interesting. And, Pak did an amazing job of, turning him at first into the sort of contemporary Rick Jones of the Marvel Universe, given his relationships with Hulk and with Hercules, but then turning him into a hero in his own right was just such a grace note. It was just a nice little creation that really took on legs. But I just don't know if it has been embraced the way it potentially could have been. As you say, it could have been the next Hulk, and let's just have Amadeus be that character.
I feel like there's only so many escape routes, and I also return to Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol, which is clearly also very influential on this run and this comic, where in the end the only escape is a maybe escape into a parallel world. Danny the world, maybe there's another better world. There has to be, doesn't there? The characters disappear from the panels of the comic book page, and we don't ever really know whether they get a happy ending or whether they just faded away or disappeared from the story. finding escape routes from the same old stories we're told over and over again is part of the challenge, I think, for fictional characters. And the Hulk really suffers here because, as you say, by the end of it, his enlightenment is you're just going to have to keep on suffering. You're basically the Job of the Marvel universe, and there's been some learning or understanding that that's how it's meant to be, but it's quite a sad story, really, in the end, over the 50 issues.
Yeah, I think so. And the Job, I could have actually almost done without the Job, which is made explicit. It's very much, we actually have an on-panel appearance of Job meeting the Absolute. But yeah, I didn't quite know what I was supposed to take away from that, as far as this notion of there being a counterweight and a sort of opposing force to the Godhead, whether that is God as we understand it, or just some sort of force for power behind all existence. I did come around on the idea that, well, yeah, this is just a personal struggle continually magnified, and that's where I said before, it presented to us as something that goes out into a cosmic scale, but it's just a personal struggle between self-loathing and trying to do something and trying to be a positive force in the world. And just the whole series then explored that as far as it possibly could, and then more or less patted you on the head and said, there you go, now some comics, off you go now. I wasn't sure where else to go with it beyond, oh, okay, violence can be a force for good and a force for evil. That's maybe I'm missing something. But I thought I'd read something that Stan Lee said. And again, this is Stan Lee's version of history, so take with a grain of salt, because he tended to revise events as they occurred to suit his own agenda at a point in time. But here he is talking about the Hulk, where the Hulk came from. I was getting tired of the normal superheroes, and I was talking to my publisher. It's probably Martin Goodman. He said, what kind of new hero can we come up with? I said, how about a good monster? He just walked out of the room. Pause for laughter. I remember Jekyll and Hyde and the Frankenstein movie with Boris Karloff, and it always seemed to me that the monster was really the good guy. He didn't want to hurt anybody, but those idiots kept chasing him up the hill until he had to strike back. So why not get a guy who looks like a monster, really doesn't want to cause any harm, but he has to in self-defense because people are always attacking him. I find that interesting as a comment. It strikes me as, because it strikes me as one that was invented after the fact. I suspect they just, if you look at the original Hulk, he's just a big grey lug who can fly, and he was basically an attempt to do Superman with maybe more of a Kirby-esque aspect to him. I mean, a lot of people have compared the original Hulk to the figure of the Golem, and perhaps you can make a thread between Kirby's Jewishness and his invoking of Jewish tradition in his comics, with Al Ewing decades later saying, let's talk about the Kabbalah, let's make this explicit, let's introduce all of that. Potentially I could maybe see that. But this idea of him being a sympathetic monster, I find that very odd as a comment from Stan Lee, because so many creatures in the Marvel universe are monstrous, and there's no sympathy for any of them. They are monsters. They need to be put down. I find it odd that he would say that. I think it speaks more to the fact that the Hulk is popular.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, in the recent run, I think that the emblematic figure is actually Betty as the Harpy. Like, they do such a great job of turning her into this genuinely disturbing looking creature, and blending Betty as the Red She-Hulk with Betty as the Harpy from the 70s. And I think Al Ewing says somewhere, I didn't want her to look like a reskinned action figure. She should look like something that you would be embarrassed to tell your therapist about. And I think that of all the characters in this, and they really strive to create some quite monstrous looking figures, the Harpy really delivers, and she's a great character. She's great in Defenders as well, but being this kind of expression of the monstrous good.
And rage as well, like justified rage as well. She's even angry about being presented as a scorned woman. You know, the lady left behind. She's like, no, fuck that, I'm not that. Like, she rejects that too. It's a rejection of, as you said before, Bruce's narrative for her. She's going, no, I don't want any part of this. I find that you're right, she's a very interesting character.
And I think there's something, you were talking about the way it goes from sort of an individual conflict to these bigger and bigger levels, and drawing on these references and Kabbalah and mysticism. And of course, we all love these deep, rich worlds, and we love mythology, and we love feeling like we're going on a Wikipedia deep dive. But I think that's where these things also weaken. And I felt the same, as I said, about Defenders, where it gets incredibly cosmic, and the more cosmic it was, the less interested I was. But the relationships were so good of, you know, right, Galactus's mum fancies Doctor Strange. That's brilliant. Like, I want more of that.
Yeah.
The configurations of the planetoids and the secret history of the origins of evil or science or magic. But what is it about us that is seeking to be nourished? Because these comics are not philosophy. They're not really an explanatory framework for the world, but we're hungry. We're hungry for these stories where there is this superstructure of not myth, but of mythology. What is it? Why do we want these sort of maps to the stars?
Sunk cost fallacy. We spend a lot of time. We need to give our college degrees an airing. I want to do due diligence and credit Jim Starlin. His cosmic stuff was so interesting for exactly the reason you outlined a moment ago, in that it was so much about the relationships between all the characters. Warlock only became interesting when Warlock's hanging out with Gamora and Pip the Troll. That's when Warlock becomes a character. When Warlock is this pure Randian piss take of an idea that Jack Kirby came up with, and it got, you know, sort of retranslated by Stan Lee. There's nothing there. There's no there. But like, Starlin comes in, tries to follow that line, then just drops the entire concept and just reinvents Warlock as this Michael Moorcockian eternal champion in this never-ending cycle of death and rebirth. And I really enjoy his cosmic stuff, because I always felt it's about these people in these strange places. And there, you could have an acid trip in an issue, but it's still rooted in a sense of, I am dying, or I am reborn. Like, that's always what it was about.
Definitely. And it makes me want to ask you something else as well, because I think one of the things that works really well with this comic is when things get re-anchored again, like eating a hot dog with the Thing, sharing a motel room with Betty as the Harpy. Like, you're back in the world, the heat and the life of the world. But when you think about the gods and everything as just being our sort of internal pantheon, and about being these primal relationships like parents and children, our lovers, everything else, you know, this is once again still harping on about fathers. You know, it's Banner's dad who is the shell, which is being inhabited by the malevolent force. His mother is barely in it. She's always absent in the underworld. She refuses to turn and look at him. Yeah. Why can't we have a Banner's mum story? What's up there?
Yeah, she's the victim. She's the murder victim. And you know, it seems to be, I think it's aware of that. And, you know, potentially Ewing's like, well, as a man, I'm not going to try and invent the woman's perspective for this character, although Betty, I think, can use, because as I said before, Betty rejects that perspective. She's just, but we don't really get to know Betty beyond her rejection generally. Like, she doesn't want to be the good wife, she doesn't want to be the one looking, and she doesn't want to be a monster. She wants none of this. She wants out, basically, and she flies out a window. But yeah, interesting point about the mum. I just finished playing the Guardians of the Galaxy video game, which I had a really good time with, but I was very grateful that the daddy issues from the movies, because the game really harkens back to the Guardians of the Galaxy movies with James Gunn, but the daddy issues that Peter has that keep coming up are largely not in the game. A lot of the game is about Peter's feelings towards his mother. and his feelings of grief to the death of his mother. And we keep cutting back to this memory of Peter's childhood, where he's in his bedroom and he's listening to a Walkman. And you, as the player, can play the Walkman. You can stop the Walkman. You can review. You can rewind and fast forward the tape. You can read lyrics on the little cassette box. I did that for a good half an hour. I really enjoyed it. But the reason why you're spending all that time in your bedroom is because if you leave your bedroom, your mother's going to die.
Right, right.
So you spend all your time, and I was like, that's brilliant. And that was the opening of the game.
That's a fine conceit for a game.
I really, really loved that. So yeah, I think it's interesting that Ewing, because I think the idea of Bruce being a victim of abuse, parental abuse, is not a recent development. I think that's at least 30 years old, possibly longer. But it's been a part of the series. It's come up in the movies as well. So it's very much part of his character. So Ewing has to address it because it's something that's been established, and it fits his theme about the personal nature of violence. But you're right. Please spare me yet another epic about daddy issues, please.
And it's not even to come at it from an angle of attack. It was so notable how absent the mother was, and literally that Bruce is begging her to turn and look at him in hell, which is very powerful, and it can be very powerful not to speak and not to be shown. But it was another absence. And I'm always reminded of in the first Ant-Man film, the bad guy turns up, threatens Scott Lang's daughter and says, sorry, sweetheart, you have to help daddy pay for his mistakes. And it's like, we've just not moved anywhere near as far as we need to. And we're how old is Dykes to Watch Out For now? Like one of the great comics of all time.
40 years.
How desperately, in a world where we talk about the Bechdel test quite happily, why has almost none of that comic really nourished the mainstream? And of course, Al Ewing has done incredible, creditable work around representation in things like Empire, the Marvel event and stuff like that. But it also just made me really feel like this is still the limit of what these mainstream comics can do. Like we haven't moved that far yet.
Yeah. And you have a reactionary fan base that, shits the bed every time you ask them to even think about that. So that's a factor, I think. It goes back to the commercial reality of these kinds of storytelling. But it's frustrating because you clearly have people working in this space who want to tell those stories. And, we in this podcast, we've profiled a number of works from that period, from the Alex and McNeil period, particularly women in the underground comic space, and just this sense of, Christ, they were really successful. Why didn't they go on to a long career? Well, there's an agenda at work. There always has to be the simple set of values being reinforced. That's why Bruce Banner can never truly die. That's why he's immortal, because dollar value associated with his name. We got to keep the old fans happy.
I think what you're highlighting for me, which is really good, and it just reminds me of my ignorance or my blinkers, is I'm just not enough of a comics person. Like that, I don't see that reactionary fan base. I don't swim enough in the world of comics and the commentary on comics. So I come to this as really literally the only mainstream comic I was reading at the time and go, oh, this is okay, but it's slightly milky tea. Understanding that there's a lot of people who want their tea even milkier, even in 2022. And that is something maybe for me to reflect on as well.
But, you raise a point, which is that, well, why do we give them any time of day at all? Like, why not just celebrate the stuff that you recognize as being of quality? And that's where the Immortal Hulk stands out to me as being, it has ambition. It is trying to address a number of issues. It has a go, and I value that. And as you say, representation is such a natural part of the storytelling. It's not served up for bonus for brownie points. It simply is the story. Jackie's story eventually gets to a point where, I think she truly sees the world as it is, and there's no possible way you can gaslight her. She actually sees everything. There's nothing you can say to her. There's no lie that you can tell her anymore. She sees the truth. I think that's a really interesting place to leave that character. But, as you said before, it's a comic book. It's a work of entertainment. Maybe we shouldn't heap such expectations on it to answer all these questions.
I mean, there's a difference though. I think storytelling should definitely get at the nerve of whatever the issue is today. Whether I expect a fully articulated philosophy of transcendence from a Hulk comic is another story. I think we just have to briefly as well, because we haven't given them the time of day as well. But the team who ends up supporting Hulk, who are sort of initially Alpha Flight, Canada's superheroes originally, then the agency that looks after space, always America's other, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's our other to the north or our other in orbit, Alpha Flight are always the other. A really lovely set of dynamics, really great characters. When they spun off into their own thing, Gamma Flight, there's just a slight lack of energy where you think, oh man, they really needed to be supporting characters to the Hulk. It would be like watching Lois and Clark, but only the supporting characters.
Right.
There's something missing there. But my God, what lovely work. That whole bunch with sort of Puck, Titania, and the Absorbing Man particularly. Yeah, just the most fun characters to watch in action, I think.
Yeah, and we talked about that. I remember at the time when those issues were coming out, we talked about how Creel, the Absorbing Man, was having a great run because you had him in Immortal Hulk, but you also had him in Black Bolt, and like that he was just this empathy these creators today have for an early Marvel thug villain is beautiful.
And it hits on this thing of not getting too quasi-scientific about the mythology. They've done a great thing with his powers. So his powers are whatever he touches, he can absorb its properties. And so they've gone, well, he got these powers by a magic spell. So what that means is a bit variable. He can absorb, the quality of an energy. He can absorb a vehicle and become that vehicle, or he can just, touch a piece of wood and turn into wood. But they do something fun with it. That is not about, what would his stats be? It's not reducing everything to a kind of listic role-playing manual. And I love that. And also, of course, Puck, like the MVP of the whole run, I think. Is
former King of Hell, Puck, yes. Which is amazing.
And that's, again, when the compression of those 50 years of comics history are lovely. Of when he talks about all the things he's done since he vowed to lead an interesting life as a child, he said, I fought the secret master of the world, and he presents it as one of the amazing things he's done, like being King of Hell. And you're like, yeah, I've read Alpha Flight comics. The master of the world isn't that impressive of a villain.
He's a bit of a dick.
Yeah. He sounds good when you put him in a list, though.
Yeah. I think our mutual friend Gareth had me on his Alpha Flight podcast a few years ago, and the master of the world was the villain. And I remember just going, he's just a neckbeard with advanced technology. He's awful. He calls himself the master of the world. Well, that's storytelling. But yes, that cast of characters, they brought so much to it. And I think, you mentioned playing with toys before, but that's very much what the Immortal Hulk becomes eventually. It's like, well, let's just put everything back in its place for the next creator to work on. But I haven't read the Gamma Flight series. I'm sorry to hear you say that it doesn't have that spark, because I do love Puck and I love Creel and I love Titania, and just spin them off on their own adventures. Let them have crazy times.
I think it's really interesting because it's something where there's something to learn about storytelling. It's a bit like when they tried to spin the lone gunmen off from the X-Files.
Yep.
They deal with a problem. They end up staying to protect this small town where more weirdness is going to happen. So they're set up that they can recur in the future if need be with the status quo. But you suddenly go, oh, part of what made you work was the fact that there was this main character who you were hunting and then supporting. And it would be like, how much would I want to watch the Perry White and Jimmy version of the 90s Superman show? There would be a gap.
Even the fact that Gamma Flight are introduced more or less as the best of what's left. Like they're the only players we still have on the board. And then later in the run, the final volume that I read, it turns out there is another crowd we can call on. They're even lower down the pecking order again. The UFOs, they're an early Hulk antagonist group, and Ewing clearly sets them up to juxtapose them with the Fantastic Four. And there's this whole odd series of issues which is like, let's have a discussion about how important the Fantastic Four are to us. And again, I had this moment of, Okay, this feels like a digression, but at least presenting this comparison between them and the UFOs was, oh, okay, so you've got evil Fantastic Four now.
Yeah, and it's again, I'm just not marinated enough in the culture really, so it's to my shame. But it's interesting. The Fantastic Four are used as the kind of the first family, right? This shining example. And there's even one of the issues does a parallel between them and the Hulk. They say, well, for them it was a rocket, not a bomb. It was cosmic rays, not gamma rays. You know, Banner and everyone involved in his world was pretty dysfunctional, and they weren't. And they do this really nice example of them as mirroring. But again, you have to be invested first of all. And for me, the best Fantastic Four comic was when Matt Fraction did FF, or Future Foundation.
Yeah, which was really about them. It was about they
go away, right? Yeah. Their substitute heroes have to step in and cover. And by their absence, you get so much more out of it than if they were there. Maybe a bit like the new He-Man series, where, you know, there's barely any He-Man in season 1. It's sometimes the impression they leave in the world, the gap made by their absence, is almost more interesting than having to watch them do stuff.
And it's interesting as well, because I think part of the reason of introducing the Fantastic Four and the UFOs is, again, to have that sort of as above, so below, contrasting, counterweight, all that idea that the series keeps returning to. But one of the examples of that is in that scene where the Thing and Hulk, as you mentioned before, have sit down, have a chat in the diner.
It's a lovely episode.
It's great. And Hulk is sort of saying, have you died? And Thing says, yes, I did. And he says, which way did you go? And in that issue, that was I remember reading, that was Mark Waid, where Thing dies and he goes to heaven, and Jack Kirby is God. Jack Kirby's there. And he's his creator. So the version of the afterlife is clearly in contrast as well, where the Thing gets to meet Jack Kirby and gets to have this beautiful little one-to-one with his actual real-life creator, and it's quite sweet. The Hulk goes down to hell and is just thrown into this perpetual cycle of and it's all, I think what was interesting to me was the Thing meets Jack Kirby. Thing is a character of Jack Kirby's. The Hulk is trapped in his own fictional cycle of abuse, and his version of hell is entirely about him. It's entirely about his suffering. And there was something about that struck me at the time as well, that Ewing, in depicting this version of his cosmology, is even at the metaphysical level, everything's about what's going on in the person's own mind. And because this series owes so much to vertical books like Swamp Thing and Sandman, all the rest of it, what's interesting about what they did about hell was actually a place, and humans were just passing through. There were creatures in hell, there was worlds in hell, there was a whole cosmology separate to us. We are minor players. In this story, hell is all about us and what we bring to hell, and our sins and our failings just populate that place. I think that's interesting, and I think it relates to Ewing's understanding of Hulk. And Hulk is a metaphor for us as people, as a sort of metaphor of rage and wrath and all the rest of it. But yeah, just the contrast between Thing gets to go to heaven, meets Jack Kirby, Hulk gets stuck in his own past and is self-loathing. There's something there. I can't quite unpack it, but there's something there.
There's a lovely blurring in the comic between initially they seem to go to hell, and then later there's quite a long sequence set inside the Hulk's own mindscape where all the different versions of the Hulk are populated. And there's a point at which you're like, are these the same place? Are they variations? Is this just a repetition? Is it meant to be a rhyme? That I think, as you say, is really, really interesting. There's also this concept in psychology of valency, which is like the valency in chemical bonds and how you connect. It's your own predisposition or proclivity to enter into certain habits and certain kinds of relationships, like someone who always takes charge, someone who always becomes the nurturer, someone who is always the joker in any given group. And I think one of the things this comic does is sort of says, you know, what is the valency of the Hulk and of all the different kinds of Hulk, both in a group of like 2 people or 5 people, but also at a level of a planet. You know, what does being Hulk like do to the kinds of relationships you can have?
Does God have a Hulk is the question this series poses. And apparently the answer is yes. Again, I was left a bit nonplussed by it, but yes. Apparently he does. One last thing for me, I have to get another dig into Jason Aaron's Avengers, but when Blade appears, Blade, a character who I was so happy to see catapulted into the big leagues, becomes an Avenger, and when I read those issues of Avengers with Blade, I was going, oh, this is so bad. This is such a stupid version of Blade. But he keeps insisting that the Hulk is a vampire. He calls him a stinking vamp, he calls him. I felt like that was someone having a dig at the sheer incongruity of Blade and at the depiction of Blade, and how it just doesn't work. I felt like he's just an idiot.
I mean, that's a good thing for us to come back to, because also actually we've talked about the massive reach that this thing does in terms of myth and mythology and religion and cosmology. We've talked quite seriously about it, but it's also a very funny run. And the bit with Blade is really very funny. And there's a bit where he puts a whole bunch of exposition in the mouth of the most childlike Hulk, where he's trying to explain that he was replaced in people's memories by the vision of the Zemnu Hulk. And he sort of has this, you know, Hulk was not Hulk, and not Hulk made humans think that Hulk was not Hulk. And he has like 2 or 3 bubbles of exposition, and then goes like, you know, Hulk can say again if puny humans don't get it. And it's just like, it's also a very funny run. And I think that, again, like the presence of the Thing, like the stuff with Betty, anything that grounds it, that means it's not just like a kind of COD philosophy, that really brought it alive for me.
That's the difference. That's the quality. That's what you want. That ability to touch people emotionally. I think we've repeated this a few times. This ability to, as you say, earth using humor. That's what makes the difference.
And because I can feel us coming towards the close of this conversation, I want to reflect on endings and the shape of endings as well. When I compare this unfavorably to other things, which says a lot more about me than about the comic or anything else, this comic has a sort of messiness to it, which is maybe the messiness of the Hulk and the messiness of all kinds of other things. You know, if I think about a nice run that feels more tailored, like James Robinson's Starman, where you feel like in the end, everything made sense along the way. It wasn't too neat, but you're like, right, the architecture is really good. And when the thing closes, it closes very poignantly. The big issues and the little issues align, and we come to a nice full stop. This doesn't do that. It's a raggedy architecture, and there's something about the way it ends. I thought that maybe it had been rushed, or they'd either given him more or fewer issues than expected, but apparently not. There's something about the ending where it feels kind of thrown together, but maybe that's the most hulkish way it could be.
Well, I always think of, again, Morrison on Batman, where, you know, there will always be a Batman. They will. I think that there's something to the effect of they will never let Batman die. I think there's some line to that. I felt that's what it was too. It was like, you know, we tried to tell this story, but now the story needs to go away. So we're going to make you feel that. We're going to make you feel that dissipation of this story. It sort of evaporates on the page as you're reading it as well. Like, it just sort of, and then Hulk is Banner walking through a city. Banner, whose own personhood was in question up until the very end. I was even at the end, I was like, so is Banner back? Or is Banner gone? You mentioned Doom Patrol. We're talking about Morrison off here, but you mentioned Doom Patrol, like that. The Crazy Jane mental architecture was directly alluded to with the Hulks, because the Hulks all had different like stops, if you like, different stops on the train line. There is a invocation of Doom Patrol here, and then as Doom Patrol ended on a street, the Immortal Hulk ends on a street, and there's a sense of, and then they were gone. That's it.
Yeah, and there's something there that, you know, this Hulk run, as others have before, plus Doom Patrol, plus things like Moon Knight, have used dissociative identity disorder in more or less accurate, more or less appropriative ways. And again, we come back to the great critic Elizabeth Sandifer, who's done a really good job of really picking at the sources for Crazy Jane as depicted in Morrison's Doom Patrol, and not being afraid to be quite critical about things that do seem a little appropriative. And I wonder if there's something there as well about the anger of the critic, that you were rejecting being Momus, the critic who got kicked off Mount Olympus for calling people too often on their on their bullshit. But there's something there about the value of it. Elizabeth Sandifer definitely is someone who has sort of an axe to grind with the world and is willing to sort of go out and fight. And that brings an immense value to her ability as a critic. Whereas, my job is largely to be professionally agnostic about as many things as I possibly can be. And you have this kind of cuddly, empathetic Hulk aspect emerging. There's something about the nature of criticism, and also maybe the limits of the kinds of conversation that you and I can have here, which ties into that question of who gets to be angry and how.
Yeah, I like that. That's interesting. And, how is it appropriate for us to celebrate this as a work, also as a comic series? Let's just call it what it is. How is it appropriate for us to celebrate it? Because aren't we just playing into that notion of prestige that you addressed before? Or was there something here that actually was coherent and concrete enough for us to come out going, that was amazing? Does it betray itself by calling attention to the fact that it's now everything's been wrapped up and we're moving these characters off to other locations for them to be picked up by other creative teams or be dropped off the face of the earth entirely? Is that clever or is that defeat? I don't quite know.
And I think the same is true, actually, for this conversation and this recording. Yes. That the more digestible we are, the more you're left at the place you started off with, the more complicit you are with the idea that the world runs in that way. And I think one of the huge challenges is to be angry and critical about the things that are wrong and unfair in the world, and to let that shine through in the way you talk about things. But also recognize your position in the cosmology of, like, from the planet that I happen to be on, what's it possible to see? What am I not seeing? What's my contribution to the wider framework? I think that's where I like this comic. Is it the ways in which it troubled me usefully?
Yeah, and I think, as we said before, there's a degree of you have a responsibility to lift up other voices that are not your own. And I feel Ewing not only uses his opportunity as a script writer in this comic to draw attention to issues that are not the issues of I assume a white British man. I'm not very familiar with Ewing personally, but also lifting up all the Hulk creative teams that came before him, and giving them a valuation that this book has been on the stands for decades for a reason. And if you go back and you visit all these different versions of this character and all these other characters that sort of emerge from different runs, Ewing goes on this amazing whistle-stop tour. And that is one of the things with this that I love, his ability to just encompass everything and bring them all in for at least one last go-round. I mentioned, was it Hot Shot? I loved Hot Shot. Hot Shot was great. But I genuinely believed Hot Shot was an original creation of this run. And I was like, no, he was there. He's an obscure character from back in the day, but Ewing dusted him off and introduced him again. Lifting up these voices, lifting up these creative teams, their work, celebrating it in such a way that we actually acknowledge, okay, everything that went before had value. That's good. Not making it about him, not making it all about Ewing, not making, I've got an original idea. It turns out 15 other people have had the same original idea. You just didn't read those issues. That's where new writers, new creative teams often fail to me. They come up with an angle that somebody else already had. And no one in the editorial and publishing house will say, actually, this has been done in 1985. Someone else did this. Ewing manages to avoid that by taking in everything and then airing it out again, and trying to create a story that merits this whistle-stop tour of every Hulk character ever.
Yeah. Again, it's about that grandeur and that ambition. I find Hotshot totally adorable. Like, of course, gamma ray finger guns. What a power to give any supervillain.
Just brilliant.
So, but let's as we close, let's really try and dig beneath the surface of the soil a little bit, and particularly, like, what is it about this kind of comic that you and I still obviously love them, and we're sitting here talking about Hulk comics, and you must remember picking up your first superhero comic. You and I both read really widely now. It's not like you have to read this kind of comic. You're playing the Guardians game. What is it about this stuff that still draws you in? Why is it these characters and this mythos and these intellectual properties? Why are they still something that matters?
I am loath to give any credence to the idea of there are myths. But there is something about these morality plays set in our world that are clearly drawing a comparison with the mythic form of storytelling, but it's set within our world. These characters are recognizably people that we would know. It's set in places that we recognize, and the fantastical element just heightens that idea of the discussion we're having. I find superheroes interesting because I think largely they are an American invention concerned with the use of power. And I think that's a very American thing. To some degree, you have the UK superheroes too, also concerned with power, but maybe a failing sense of that power because that reflects UK standing in the world. And for an Irish person, that is very much as saying, well, that's nice, isn't it? Isn't it great you guys have got that? We don't have superheroes because we don't have power. And I like that. I think that attracts me, that sort of awareness of the state of the world through junk media. Maybe there's some truth there. And then maybe that's why I keep coming back and saying, I feel like these popular forms of culture are a way of people from positions of privilege, positions of power, to tell on themselves. And there's a truth there. And where you have people upset about Jackie calling out Bruce Banner on his privilege, that says so much. You can't even have the character have that conversation with him. That says so much to me about the kind of conversations you're allowed to have, even in a fictional space.
That's so fascinating to me. And even the notion of, like, are there homegrown superheroes in Ireland? I remember being 4 or 5 years old, and there's a Marvel comic and the dude's got a great big Union Jack painted across his face because there's a Captain Britain weekly or whatever it was. But there's something there that, because they come into our lives when we're so young as well, that I think is really interesting. I was given like a really weird reprint compendium by my mum when I was like 5 or 6. And they must have thrown together any old stuff because it's the weirdest, queerest compilation. It's the one where the Silver Surfer gets drugged by English warlocks with drugged tea so that they can enslave him. And one where the Vision fights Ms. Marvel very early in her existence, having mistaken her for a terrorist. And again, it's just like slightly queer or body horror-ish. The Vision concusses her by putting his hand inside her. She then traps him in this kind of like jury-rigged net. And there was something about the weirdness of these stories and the uncomfortable things they did to our bodies and our identity, which sounds like I'm intellectualizing, but I'm not at all, because you feel it when you're a 6-year-old. There was something about the essential weirdness of these comics, not the red, white, and blue, not the macho, not that side, which is what drew me in. And again, I think that's part of what's in here with Hulk, maybe.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I just as an aside, you're mentioning of English warlocks drugging Sandman. I'm going, Christ, did Neil Gaiman read that too when he was a kid? And that's where we get that version of the Sandman with the being captured by an English occultist in his basement. But yes, I think you've tied a bow on this whole conversation, because that sense of the body and the bodily decay, bodily distortion, violence upon the body, when the child Hulk gets torn apart and chunks being bitten out of him. The sheer spectacle of horror, so much of it in this book is our awareness of how vulnerable our bodies are. And the Hulk's vulnerability is even that more terrible to us because of that. That is where the horror of the series really lies, just this sense of the body and our mortality being so bound up with our physical coherence. What if the Hulk, who hasn't got that, how terrible would that be? That's very interesting.
Yeah, what a wonderful point. I think that is a great insight. You know, we go from the moment where he's chopped up into jars by people doing experiments on him, and he's almost laughing at it because he knows that he's going to be able to overcome it. He's letting them experiment on him so he learns his own capacity. But then by the end of the run, you feel this great torment that it even hurts to watch him change in this comic. You know, there's a point where the Hulk's arm comes out of Banner's mouth. Banner doesn't look particularly happy at this. Like, you think, my God, that man is feeling every moment of this change. And yeah, maybe there's something in that recognition of vulnerability that is the sweetest and the most powerful thing about this run. Thanks, Emmet.
Yeah, I think we'll leave it there. Dr. Matt, thank you so much.
Always a joy. Thank you.
The Immortal Hulk is published by Marvel. By the way, Emmet is part of an anthology comic called the BeBop, whose second issue is currently running a Kickstarter campaign. The theme for this issue is food, family, and memories, and Emmet is the artist on a story called How to Win a Raid. Follow the link in the show notes to check out the Kickstarter. You can help the Deconstructing Comics family of podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. And go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. This Saturday, Critiquing Comics returns as Jason and I discuss The Nine Circles, Martial Law #1. Then next week, it's back to the Fourth World as Emmet and I talk about Jack Kirby's Mr. Miracle, issues 7 through 12. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.